Hi, everyone. We are now live. Welcome to the fourth session of the ISJL Virtual Vacation. Today, we are joined by Dr. Josh Parshall. He's the ISJL's Director of History, and we're having a conversation about Southern Jews and civil rights. I just want to sort of frame where we are in the virtual vacation at this moment. We've learned a lot over the past year since, I don't know, say mid-March, just to pluck a date out of thin air. We've learned a lot about the challenges we face as a country and the ties that bind us and the things that we can do to sort of stay connected to each other. And that's really why we developed the virtual vacation. And it's why we're heading into the high holidays with virtual vacation programming centered around the civil rights movement. We're talking about the history of the movement, how that history intersects with the history of the Jewish South, and how the work of the civil rights movement continues in the present. So this first session is really meant to introduce you to this history and to really complicate our understandings of the civil rights movement and Jews' responses to and involvement in the movement. So we're gonna draw on what we discussed today in future sessions of the virtual vacation. So I'm really excited about this session. I'll also add that this session is meant to raise a lot of questions. There are going to be lots of opportunities to talk about those questions. And so as we move through the presentation, please throw those questions in the comments on the video, and we'll answer as many as we can during our Q&A session at the end. I'd also like to mention before we begin that today, September 15th, is the 57th anniversary of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. On September 15th, 1963, members of the Klan perpetrated a terrorist bombing at this church in Birmingham and murdered Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair. And this was really a turning point one turning point of many in the civil rights movement. And it came at the end of a long summer in Birmingham as activists fought for desegregation of downtown businesses and fair labor practices, school desegregation, equal justice under the law. They were fighting against violent tactics by police. And so because we're talking about civil rights today, I think it's important to take a moment to recognize this moment in American history and to honor the memory of Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair. So without further ado, I want to again welcome Dr. Josh Parshall back to the ISJL Virtual Vacation. Josh is the director of the ISJL's History Department. He serves as editor of the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities. So welcome back, Josh, and take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Today is probably a little, I'm going to talk at you for a little while. So I'm going to jump into that. We'll have time for questions afterwards. And really, I'm going to give you a quick, pretty in-depth overview of Southern Jewish responses to Black civil rights, to the struggle for Black equality and for racial justice. And that's a theme that's going to continue for a couple more weeks. Let's see, I think Nora, we're ready for the first slide. In the 1988 play, Driving Miss Daisy, Alfred Uhry depicts the long development of the relationship between Daisy Worthen, a wealthy white Jewish woman born in 1878, and Hope Colburn, the African-American chauffeur who works for her over the course of 25 years. The play and its film adaptation take place in Atlanta, in and around the years of what we know as the classical civil rights movement. And even as a fictionalized story, it serves as a useful entry point to the topic of Southern Jews and Black civil rights. In an early scene, Daisy complains to her son that Hoke took a can of salmon from the pantry the day before. She compares Black domestic workers to, quote, children, and predicts that he will deny eating the fish. Hoke soon enters with a replacement can, which puts Daisy in her place. With her infantilizing language, Daisy deploys a common racist trope and reveals herself to have internalized aspects of American and Southern white supremacy. In particular, this kind of language props up a myth of benevolent white paternalism. 3/4 of the way through the play, Hoke and Daisy are stuck in traffic on the way to a synagogue at the Temple, Atlanta's established Reform congregation. It's 1958. Hoke gets out to investigate, and when he returns, tells Daisy the synagogue has been bombed. Daisy insists that it must have been a mistake. Perhaps they meant to bomb a conservative or Orthodox synagogue. Hoke connects the anti-Semitic violence to anti-Black violence, recalling a lynching that he witnessed as a child. Daisy rejects the comparison. The scene illustrates a few points. First, Daisy assumes that acculturation, financial success, and adhering to local practices of racial differentiation would insulate Atlanta Jews from the turbulence of the era and the rising tide of white supremacist backlash. Second, Urey uses Hoke to draw a line between anti-Jewish and anti-Black violence. On one hand, the Atlanta temple bombing and similar attacks on Southern synagogues, both failed and successful, were carried out by white supremacist terrorists who saw Jews as masterminds behind the civil rights movement. That idea, by the way, continues to animate white nationalist movements. On the other hand, the comparison flattens the significant differences between the degrees of violence that Black and Jewish Southerners faced before, during, and after the height of the movement, as well as the risks that members of those groups took to pursue justice. Furthermore, having Hope deliver the comparison authenticates a connection that Urey is actually making, and it may or may not reflect how actual Black Southerners viewed Jews, understood to be white, in relation to white non-Jews. The third and final scene I'll point to involves the Nobel Peace Prize banquet held for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1965. Daisy has purchased tickets, but her son, Booley, informs her that he is reluctant to go, citing business risks. He argues that the white, non-Jewish men he deals with will start to talk behind his back, leave him out of lunches, or withhold favors and information. He claims to support King, of course, but rationalizes his fears by noting that his own personal presence will not actually matter for the event. So in Driving Miss Daisy, we have a Jewish Southerner doing something racist, a somewhat simplified implication about Black Jewish commonalities as outsiders and targets of bigotry, and the portrayal of a Jewish Southerner who would love to take a stand, but feels like it is too much of a risk. For all the critiques of Driving Miss Daisy, aimed primarily at the film, which won the Best Picture award over Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, it does introduce the major themes of today's topic. Like Urey, historians and other commentators have tended to suggest a natural or innate empathy between Jews and African Americans. And they've often characterized Southern Jews' reluctance to publicly confront racism as a consequence of small Jewish numbers and their tenuous social status. At the same time, historical evidence provides us with a range of examples of Southern Jews internalizing, defending, and enacting white supremacy in a variety of ways. With my time today, I want to examine this tension between the competing narratives of Jewish empathy and Jewish complicity. We'll start in the late 19th century. It's important for a number of reasons to view the classical era of the civil rights movement, roughly 1954 to 1965, as part of a longer struggle. For one thing, the segregationist practices known as Jim Crow weren't simply a continuation of centuries-old patterns, but a historically situated set of laws and customs that emerged after the end of Reconstruction. Additionally, the civil rights era wasn't the first time that Black Southerners fought against segregation and other forms of mistreatment, and it's instructive to consider Jewish responses to race and racism in the run-up to the mid-20th century. Following the end of the Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved African Americans, many white Southerners rejected the imposed rules of Reconstruction and sought a return to white political and economic dominance. So-called redeemers appealed to racial solidarity among white Southerners and used intimidation, violence, economic threats, and political action to suppress Republican and Black votes. A few Southern Jews took part in such movements, including a handful of Jews who belonged to the early Ku Klux Klan, and Edson Moyse and H.H. De Leon of South Carolina, both of whom belonged to an anti-Black terrorist group known as the Red Shirts. A small number of Southern Jews, including Samuel Fleischman of Marianna, Florida, became active in Republican politics and supported Black civil and economic rights. That was a dangerous stance to take, and Fleischman was murdered in 1869 by a vigilante group known as the Regulators. When redemption swept the South, see the 1890 Mississippi Constitution and the Wilmington Coup of 1898 for prime examples, most Jews in the South went along with the white majority, even if they were not leaders in the redemption movements. The so-called redeemers were rarely explicitly anti-Semitic, and when they targeted Jews, their victims' religious backgrounds were generally incidental. Likewise, there's little or no evidence that Republican Jews in the South supported Black rights for religious reasons. So we can look at the case of Samuel Fleischman in Northern Florida, and it's not clear that he took his political stances because of his Jewish background or that he was particularly targeted for being Jewish. By the early 20th century, the Jim Crow system was beginning to take shape. Following the disruption of the old plantation economy, ongoing urbanization, and increasing industrialization across the region, white elites enacted legal codes, business practices, and social customs that addressed new anxieties around race, class, and gender by asserting white supremacy and fostering white solidarity. At the same time, the emergence of what historian Eric Goldstein calls racial radicalism caused white, non-Jewish Southerners to look with renewed scrutiny at their Jewish neighbors. Established Jews, often native-born Southerners with roots in Central Europe, took pains to affirm their whiteness, even if they maintained some ambivalence. More recent arrivals, generally poorer and originating in Eastern Europe, tended to feel less pressure to conform to racial codes. But in the words of historian Clive Webb, neither group of Jews was able to oppose or resist the basic social structures of the Jim Crow South in any direct or sustained way. Still, individual Jews in various parts of the South did push back against aspects of white supremacy. Recent immigrants often opened businesses that catered to Black customers, sometimes living in or near the segregated neighborhoods they served. Chaya Rochel Andrus, a Yiddish poet in Dallas, later recalled that her children, quote, had for playmates the barefoot children of the neighborhood, not being afflicted with the virus of selectivity in their choice of whom to play ball with on the green fields and hills of the wide Texan environment. Anecdotally, Jewish merchants gained reputations for treating Black customers more respectfully, although the evidence for that generalization is far from conclusive. Some established Jews also promoted African-American uplift in the progressive era. Mark Bauman writes of several examples in Atlanta who worked with groups like the Urban League or anti-lynching campaigns to secure resources for African-Americans and protest the most flagrant abuses of the era. Rabbi Ira Sanders of Little Rock worked in a similar mold and even attempted to open a social work school in town on an integrated basis. These efforts were at once laudable for their time and to varying degrees deserve a critical assessment. Both Rabbi Sanders and the Atlanta Jewish progressives used euphemistic language of racial cooperation and understanding that misframes white supremacy as a bilateral conflict. And the racial uplift model of the time tends to assume Black adherence to white middle-class norms as a precondition for greater equality. Scholar Ibram X. Kendi calls this approach uplift suasion and notes that it places responsibility for correcting racism on the backs of racism's victims. There were Jews in the region who took greater risks in the interwar era. In the early 1930s, at least 2 Alabama rabbis spoke out in support of the Scottsboro Boys, 9 young African-American men falsely accused of raping 2 white girls. Southern Jews may have had extra incentive to avoid speaking out about the trial, as the defendants were represented by New York Jewish lawyers from the communist-affiliated International Labor Defense. One of those Alabama rabbis, Benjamin Goldstein Lowell of Temple Beth Or in Montgomery, actually resigned his position rather than remain silent on the issue. At the political fringe of the Jewish community, in some of the larger cities, members of the socialist-leaning Workmen's Circle and the communist-linked International Workers' Order supported efforts at biracial organizing and activism. The communists were more consistent in their support for Black equality, and Sam Borenstein, a Jewish grocer in Chattanooga, ran for governor of Tennessee on the Communist Party ticket with a Black running mate. Although these individual Jews, for whatever reasons, sought to ameliorate aspects of anti-Black racism, white supremacy was a ubiquitous force in American and Southern cultures, and Southern Jews generally accommodated themselves to the dominant ideology of their new surroundings. In Maryland, a marginally Southern state, Jewish politicians Isidore Rayner and Isaac Loeb Strauss championed a disenfranchisement bill that restricted Black voting rights beginning in 1908 and was actually known as the Strauss Amendment. More commonly, Southern Jews understood the stark white-Black divisions of the South as a safeguard against their own marginalization. So long as they upheld the hierarchy, and barring certain minor disadvantages, they would reap the benefits of white identity. The classical era of the civil rights movement, as defined by activist Bayard Rustin, began with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 and ended with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, 1964, and the Voting Rights Act, 1965. The rising tide of activism and the corresponding backlash of Southern segregationists subjected the region's Jews to contradictory pressure. On one hand, national Jewish organizations vocally supported the cause of desegregation. Within 2 years of the 1954 Brown verdict, the Anti-Defamation League, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and other national Jewish groups had passed resolutions calling for the Southern states to comply with the ruling. During the trial itself, the Anti-Defamation League had, quote, issued an amicus curiae brief in support of the NAACP's position, end quote. Additionally, Northern Jews marshaled significant financial support for civil rights organizations, including CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, SNCC, that's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Northern leaders reacted with dismay and sometimes condemnation when they found Southern co-religionists unwilling or unable to take public action on the issue. In some cases, Southern Black leaders also looked to Southern Jews for support. The Montgomery Improvement Association, for example, hoped that local Jews would speak up on behalf of the 1955-1956 bus boycott. But the Montgomery Jewish community stayed silent throughout the 381-day action. In this and other instances of Jewish inaction, fear did prove a factor, but Jews' own adherence to Southern white supremacy also played a role. By the early 1950s, many Southern Jews occupied a fairly comfortable position. The post-war era marked a historical apex in American religious affiliation, and the emerging ideal of America's so-called Judeo-Christian heritage reflected a growing sense of acceptance on the part of non-Jews. In medium and large Southern cities, Jews began to migrate from middle and working class neighborhoods near downtown to new suburban developments. As merchants, employers, landlords, and/or bankers, they benefited from the fruits of Black labor, and their social mobility, expressed physically in moves to new suburbs, reflected what George Lipsitz calls the possessive investment in whiteness. In addition to their material interest in maintaining the status quo, Southern Jews, like other Americans, absorbed a steady stream of racist anti-Black messages. In small towns and in large cities, the daily reality of Southern life reinforced the idea of Black inferiority. From popular songs to criminal law, American culture assumed Black people to be weak, violent, jolly, untrustworthy, overly sexual, and immature. At the same time, Confederate memorials and Old South pageantry presented a romanticized view of antebellum culture that framed enslavers as a noble and benevolent ruling class that had been unfairly stripped of power and status. Jews not only consumed these images and these messages, but they also participated in their dissemination through blackface minstrel performances, plantation-themed social events, and acts of Confederate commemoration. As the civil rights movement gained momentum in the post-war era then, most Southern Jews had absorbed the region's potent forms of white supremacy for years and had a material stake in defending structures of inequality. This was even true for those who questioned the received logic of Jim Crow segregation. As Southern Jews continued to internalize and benefit from white supremacy, they also faced renewed pressures to distance themselves from civil rights causes. In 1951, Jewish institutions in and around Miami had suffered from a rash of attempted bombings, most of which failed. Shortly afterward, anti-Semitic literature from the Christian Anti-Jewish Party began to appear regularly in Atlanta. Within months of the Brown decision, segregationists in Indianola, Mississippi, founded the White Citizens Council, which quickly developed into a regional movement. The Citizens Councils presented a respectable middle-class facade, but they used threats and intimidation to recruit reluctant members and silence moderate liberals. While the local and state council groups often made efforts to distance themselves from open anti-Semites, anti-Jewish literature often circulated through the organization. Outside the councils, extremist white nationalist organizations used threats of desegregation as evidence for a global Judeo-Bolshevik plot in which Black activists were merely pawns. And that, I should want to note here, echoes conspiracy theories that we hear today. The presence of overt anti-Semitic rhetoric in the massive resistance movement alarmed Jews inside and outside the region and remained a problem throughout the period. In 1957 and 1958, the inflammatory speech turned to violence, with a series of attacks and attempted attacks on synagogues and community centers. The chain of incidents began with a failed bombing attempt at Temple Beth El in Charlotte in November 1957. 5 more attacks followed over the next 5 months, though most of these resulted in fuse failures. Temple Beth El in Miami and the Nashville Jewish Community Center did sustain damage, however. Then the temple was bombed in Atlanta in the early morning of October 12, 1958. The repairs were estimated to cost $200,000. These attempts to terrorize Jewish communities were seemingly based on the idea of Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. But the Atlanta congregation was the only one of those targeted during that late 50s spree that had a strong record of engaging the struggle. Nashville Rabbi William Silverman actually remarked that he was embarrassed at the local Jewish community's silence on civil rights prior to the attack there. His feeling was that if they had been attacked, they may as well have done the right thing in order to deserve it. Bombings instilled fear in some cases, but they also galvanized local Jews, right? Why not speak out if you're going to be targeted anyways? And the attacks swayed public sentiment against at least the most violent edge of the segregationist movement. These bombings also attracted federal law enforcement attention and forced the federal government to intervene against some of these white supremacist and segregationist groups. We should, as Nora mentioned early on, we have to place these synagogue bombings and these community center attacks in the context of church bombings against Black congregations, which were more prevalent, more deadly, and less likely to receive proper investigation by law enforcement. So what did Southern Jews do? A few Jews figured prominently in the segregationist backlash to the Brown decision and the rise of Black activism. One thing we have here is a pamphlet against desegregation that was authored anonymously by a Mississippi Delta Jew and circulated by the Citizens Council of Greenwood. Al Binder, a Jackson, Mississippi attorney, was, according to Clive Webb, one of the most articulate spokespersons in defense of segregation. That's a direct quote, and served as the prosecutor in the case against the Freedom Riders in 1961. In the South Carolina legislature, Speaker of the House Solomon Blatt helped to delay statewide desegregation until 1970. Saul Tepper of Selma, Alabama, served as the mouthpiece of Selma Sheriff Jim Clark. In the build-up to Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965, and the subsequent march from Selma to Montgomery, which occurred on March 25th, Tepper attacked the press for presenting sympathetic depictions of civil rights protesters. He also developed a conspiracy theory around the death of Unitarian Reverend James Reeb of Boston, who was murdered following a minister's march on March 9th, 1965. According to Tepper, the murder was a false flag operation, that in fact the movement was responsible for Reeb's death, rather than it being the result of a beating Reeb received from segregationist vigilantes. These examples, which all appear in Clive Webb's Fight Against Fear, lead Webb to the conclusion that the most notable Jewish segregationists acted as individuals. We see the defense of segregation in the South coming not so much from Southern Jewish organizations as from a few outspoken individuals. The one exception to that would probably be a splinter group from B'nai B'rith, which formed in the Mississippi Delta, where Jews uncomfortable with B'nai B'rith's stance on desegregation actually left the organization. Still, the existence of such ardent Jewish segregationists indicates that Jewishness alone was not a surefire inoculant against white supremacy. Furthermore, such segregationists gained credibility as representatives of the general Jewish view whenever other Jews remained silent. They also provided cover for anti-Semitic organizations or organizations that tolerated anti-Semitism to push away claims. They could say, oh, these Jewish folks agree with us, therefore we're not anti-Semitic. More common than the firebrands were the Jewish merchants who joined the local white citizens council reluctantly, or those individuals who simply sought to avoid controversy by remaining publicly neutral. The average Southern Jew was neither a diehard segregationist nor a vocal proponent of Black civil rights, after all. Studies and surveys from the 1950s and 1960s suggests that Jews in the South were much more likely than white Southern Protestants to view desegregation as, quote, inevitable and in general desirable. They were also about a third as inclined to describe African Americans as, quote, constitutionally inferior. At the same time, however, the anecdotal notion that Black and Jewish Southerners enjoyed mutual respect was not a given. A 1959 study in the Deep South suggested that African Americans there understood Jews to be more racist than white non-Jews. In the same year, only 15% of white non-Jews reported that Jews were more supportive of Black civil rights than other white Southerners. Just to make that clear, basically most white Christians didn't identify Jews as being more supportive of desegregation or Black rights in general. So historian Mark Bauman explains these discrepancies as the consequence of a lag between Southern Jews' private attitudes and public actions. It may also be worth inquiring whether Southern Jews felt compelled to present themselves as racially liberal in the context of polls, even as they remained fairly comfortable with the status quo of racial segregation. We can also just sort of ask ourselves whether private views matter much in the face of public silence. As for Southern Jews who took tangible action in support of Black civil rights, their work depended on both their personal strengths and interests, as well as the challenges of the local environment. Alan Krauss, who interviewed several Southern Reform rabbis on the topic in 1966, while he himself was in rabbinical school, divided his interviews into two groups: those who worked in the, quote, land of the almost possible, and those who worked in, quote, the land of the almost impossible. In the more progressive cities of the South, rabbis and lay Jews were not the only white residents who supported desegregation. They had the possibility of working as part of interfaith committees and liberal social welfare organizations. Rabbis in these communities preached racial tolerance from their pulpits and even made public statements without significant pushback from their congregants. Rabbi Feibelman in New Orleans, for example, had hosted interracial groups in Temple Sinai since the late 1940s. And Rabbi Jacob Rothschild in Atlanta was among the co-chairs of the Martin Luther King Jr. Nobel Banquet in Atlanta in 1965. In the land of the almost impossible, rabbis and other Jews acted with fewer white allies and at greater personal risk. Perry Nussbaum, rabbi of Jackson, Mississippi's Beth Israel congregation from 1954 to 1973, had already served at a number of congregations and intended to ride out the remainder of his career in the quiet South. Instead, Nussbaum stepped into a Deep South pulpit right as the Brown decision inaugurated years of civic tension and social unrest. Nussbaum already struggled to connect with congregants. He was opinionated and he was domineering. In his first years at Beth Israel, he alienated some members of the highly acculturated congregation with his insistence on greater ritual observance. Then, in the early 1960s, he began to speak out on civil rights. Although, as Webb points out, his work was more clandestine than counterparts in larger and more progressive cities. The Freedom Rides began in early 1961 as activists with the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, rode interstate bus lines from Washington, D.C. into the Deep South. When the original riders faced violent attacks and police apathy in Anniston, Birmingham, and Montgomery, Alabama, SNCC activists, that's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, from Nashville took their places for the trip to Mississippi. Over the course of the summer, 328 activists were arrested at the Jackson bus station, and local authorities began relocating arrestees to infamous Parchman Penitentiary in June. Parchman was and remains, by the way, a working plantation. Nussbaum felt no particular admiration for the civil rights agitators, arguing that they were interlopers who had escalated an already tense situation. He prided himself on never denying chaplaincy services to a fellow Jew, however, and decided to counsel them during their incarceration. Throughout the summer of 1961, he made weekly trips to the prison, 140 miles or more each way, providing emotional and spiritual support, delivering soap and cigarettes, and relaying messages in and out of the maximum security wing where the protesters were held. Although he was officially there to minister to the Jewish prisoners, he ultimately served the needs of all the incarcerated activists. The only other Mississippi rabbi to visit the prison was Charles Mantonband of Hattiesburg, who had long been known for his integrationist stances. His drive, it should be noted, was even longer than Rabbi Nussbaum's. And it's necessary to note here that Beth Israel Congregation in Jackson was bombed in 1967, and Nussbaum's home was bombed a few weeks later. Those attacks galvanized elements of Jackson's moderate white community against violent extremists. And then in 1968, the bombers were apprehended in Meridian, Mississippi, after bombing the synagogue education building there and attempting to bomb the home of Jewish leader Meyer Davidson. Whereas progressive Southern rabbis were at the time exclusively men, many of the other Southern Jews who acted in support of desegregation and Black civil rights were women. In Little Rock and other cities, Jewish women helped lead efforts to keep public schools open when segregationist politicians moved to close schools rather than integrate. Gertrude Wheel, a wealthy club woman and progressive in Goldsboro, North Carolina, was already in her 1970s when the Brown decision came down. She had developed from a cautious race moderate in the 1920s into an unapologetic desegregationist by then, and fought against the foot dragging of white North Carolina politicians. In 1958, Wheel and her family donated a plot of land and $30,000 for a new park and swimming pool in a Black neighborhood. At 83 years old, she wore a robe with an old-fashioned swimsuit underneath to the 1963 dedication of the facility, and inaugurated the pool by diving in and then, quote, inviting the excited children to follow her. From the mid-1960s until the early 1970s, the Atlanta chapter of the National Council of Jewish Women focused volunteer efforts on recruiting and screening poor women for federal jobs training programs and providing tutoring and other services for children in underserved schools. This was all part of the national organization's sort of affiliation with the war on poverty during that era. Both programs, the job training and the school tutoring, addressed white and Black communities alike, but the council's cross-racial work proves especially illustrative of liberal Jews' politics in the Southern metropolis. So historian and author Emily Katz shows that council projects were prone to paternalism, assuming that middle-class, usually white women could lead disadvantaged young people out of poverty by showing them how to behave properly. As new youth-led cohorts of Black activists develop racial critiques aimed at the structural rather than the personal nature of racial and class inequalities, they came to question the efficacy and even the motives of such interventions by well-off white liberals. To their credit, the Atlanta Council grappled with these problems in the 1970s, even if the organization and its members sometimes struggled to overcome their own pre-assumptions about what the situation was and what its solutions might be. In addition to these examples, Southern Jewish responses to the arrival of Jewish activists in the North provide some of the clearest illustrations of their attitudes. During the 1950s, conflicts between Southern and Northern Jews over civil rights took place primarily at a distance through the medium of national organizations, such as the Anti-Defamation League, which was then part of B'nai B'rith, the American Jewish Committee, or the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. The rise of direct action in the 1960s brought Northern activists into closer proximity with Southern Jews. Southern Jews redoubled their efforts to distance themselves from the movement when that happened. Whereas they had once denounced statements and decisions by Northern-dominated national bodies, they now faced the overrepresentation of Northern Jews among white civil rights activists. Among white participants in the 1961 Freedom Rides, for example, an estimated 50% or more were Jewish. One ambitious estimate suggests 2/3. In Birmingham, the local B'nai B'rith president anxiously denounced the group to the press. After 16 rabbis were arrested in St. Augustine, Florida, after joining Martin Luther King Jr. in a protest there, a local white supremacist reported that the synagogue president had said that the rabbis, quote, weren't Jews at all, end quote, but were, quote, kikes, end quote. Now that is coming from the mouth of a vocal white supremacist, but it's telling that at least in his mind, local Jewish leadership would want to differentiate themselves from white activists, in this case rabbis, and even question the legitimacy of their Judaism or Jewishness. In Selma, the local rabbi refused a phone call from a protester and fellow rabbi because he feared that the phone was tapped and that he would lose his job. Southern Jews objected to the perceived interference of Northern activists on several grounds. They argued that outsiders, especially Jewish ones, stirred up controversy without having to live with the consequences. As I'll discuss momentarily, of course, Those activists did take on extraordinary risks, even if they did so for shorter periods of time. Additionally, stirring up controversy was the tactic. Civil disobedience and direct action work when they uncover already existing crises, push simmering states of injustice into the public eye, and force people to choose sides. Second, Southern Jews resented the idea that the South was uniquely racist. Racial segregation divided Northern cities as well, and Northern Jews did participate in white flight out of integrating urban neighborhoods. This argument was both a straw man, as a number of Jewish activists who visited the South had also confronted racial discrimination and disparities in their home cities, and it was also a deflection designed to bring a charge of hypocrisy as a way of ending the congregation. Still, the South has been pathologized in national discourse for decades in ways that contribute to a kind of sensitivity, or contributed to a kind of sensitivity on the part of Jewish Southerners. And Northern activists might have taken more time to build relationships with Jewish moderates in the South. Webb quotes from a Freedom Summer volunteer who acknowledged that few Jewish activists attended the synagogue, which raises a question of whether they would have been welcome in some of these Southern congregations, or whether it was worth taking the time. After all, they were there to work with Black activists, right? The movement wasn't about Southern Jews. Southern Jews' disdain for Jewish activists from the North also showed in their reactions to violent attacks that took place during the movement. During the Mississippi Summer Project of 1964, now referred to as Freedom Summer, Jews from outside the region once again participated in high numbers. The project focused on education and voter registration, delivered through local freedom schools throughout the state. On July 10th, two violent segregationists attacked a group of volunteers, including Rabbi Arthur Leleveld of Cleveland, Ohio, beating him and two others with a metal weapon. Leleveld lost a large quantity of blood from a gash above his eye and suffered a concussion. He was hospitalized overnight. When a Cleveland reporter called Herbert and Lou Ginsburg early the next morning, Herbert, who was somewhat taken aback by the early hour of the call, described the attack as terrible, but also placed some responsibility on the rabbi, who had been, quote, in the wrong place, end quote. By the time of the Hattiesburg attack, James Chaney, a Black Mississippian, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, both white Jews, had been missing for 2 weeks. Their bodies were discovered in Neshoba County, Mississippi on August 4th. Clive Webb quotes a merchant who said, quote, "Sure, I felt sorry for those boys, but nobody asked them to come down here and meddle with our way of life." Another Jewish Mississippian reported that the community was scared to death. Those two quotes, an active claim on segregation as, quote, our way of life, and an open admission of fear, present dual narratives once again. A Jewish embrace of segregation and white supremacy versus a silence driven primarily by fear. And of course, the two are not mutually exclusive. Jews in the South, like Jews anywhere in the United States and beyond, had absorbed tenets of white supremacy, including obviously racist notions of innate Black inferiority and more subtly damaging assumptions about the necessity of Black assimilation to white middle-class norms. The activities of Jewish segregationists and Jewish progressives alike demonstrate that internalization. Furthermore, they had stakes in the maintenance of racist economic systems, whether they benefited from cheap labor, suppressed competition from Black-owned businesses, or other means. At the same time, there were also real risks in challenging white supremacy, so that even those Jews who wanted desegregation, or who might have been willing, like some of the Atlanta councilwomen, to challenge their own racism, had to overcome legitimate fears. They feared social discomfort in cross-racial interactions. They feared ostracization from white peers. They feared economic loss. They feared state surveillance. And they feared bodily harm, not only to themselves, but to their families and their communities. So there was, as Clive Webb posits, a fight against fear. But I would add that it was ultimately a fight against white supremacy, which entailed fights against apathy, against comfort, and indeed also against fear. In the decades since the end of the classical era in the civil rights struggle, Jewish participation in the movement has come to occupy a central place in 20th century American Jewish history. The Jewish Americans series, which aired on PBS in 2008, dedicates almost 20 minutes to the topic in its episode on Jewish life after World War II. At times, the tenor of these historical memories has been self-congratulatory. It's a history that can either bolster American Jews' sense of an ongoing obligation to pursue justice, or it can serve as a tool for white Jews to avoid difficult conversations about ongoing racism in American society. Even in the South, some congregations that balked at rabbis' and members' civil rights activities now embrace the Jewish aspect of the movement. I would say that Beth Israel congregation here in Jackson is to some degree an example of that. There's currently a historical marker commemorating Nussbaum's involvement in the Freedom Rides, as well as the bombing of the congregation right out in front of the synagogue, right? This is a synagogue where a strong segment of the congregation was fairly opposed to Nussbaum's activities. So this history of Jewish relationships to white supremacy and Black civil rights also have continued and renewed relevance in the face of both increasing diversity, racial, sexual, and otherwise, among American Jews, as well as the rising visibility of white nationalist ideologies and white nationalist violence in the United States today. Importantly, the varied experiences and actions of Southern Jews during and beyond the peak years of the movement complicate any simple narrative about Jews, American Jews, and Black civil rights. First, the Jewish South demonstrates a long history of Jewish engagement with systems and race and racism, as Jews in the region have had to negotiate their places in a shifting landscape of race and class for centuries. The 1950s and the 1960s certainly brought the problem to the forefront of the national consciousness, but Black Americans have struggled for years against oppression and continue to do so today. Second, the Southern Jewish story, in which Jews are intimately bound up in a racially differentiated economic system, shows how racial status is materialized and made durable in property and the accumulation of wealth. In other words, adhering to systems of segregation allowed Jews to do well for themselves, which reaffirmed their whiteness, even as the threat of losing status and privilege dissuaded some Jews from challenging segregation and discrimination in public. Of course, others were all in on white supremacy. They benefited from it and they believed in it. Finally, the Southern story shows how difficult it actually is to act in allyship, how complicated and elusive solidarity can be. So that's what I have for you now. I look forward to hopefully answering a few questions from the chat and continuing to talk about this in the future.
Thank you so much, Josh. I learned so much in the past 40 minutes, and I'm so excited to have some questions from folks. Again, I'll remind people watching that you can feel free to put questions in the Facebook comments, and we'll get to them during our Q&A. I'll start off with a question of my own because I have the privilege of being on the Zoom call. So I'm curious, Josh, if you can, and you talked about this a little bit in the presentation, but just sort of like right off the bat, like, can you talk about sort of what like the source material is like for this topic, and like how we can find out about what Southern Jews' attitudes were, what actions they were taking, how we hear their voices directly.
Yeah. So the probably the three big sort of books, just Clive Webb's Fight Against Fear, Eric Goldstein's Price of Whiteness, as well as a chapter that he did in one of the collections on Southern Jewish history that more specifically focuses on Jewish racial status in the South, are two places to go for secondary resources. Those interviews that Rabbi Alan Krauss did when he was in rabbinical school, I believe those are from the late 60s. So he went to a conference at which there were a number of Southern rabbis and asked them questions. Those interviews are collected in a book called To Stand Aside or To Stand Alone. They're also available on a website. Alan Krauss, of blessed memory, passed away a few years ago. His son Steve has continued to work with those materials with the help of Mark Baumann, who's been an important figure in the Southern Jewish Historical Society. In terms of primary sources, in some cases, We have things like sermons. We have diaries. The diary of Charles Manton Band in Hattiesburg, for example, is a good source on this. There are oral histories with Jews from the South, many of which live at the Institute of Southern Jewish Life. There, for Atlanta, there's a real wealth of documents, of course, at the Bremen Museum there in the Cuba family archives, including, you could look at the papers of Rabbi Rothschild, as well as a number of Atlanta folks. There's a wealth, I would say, of documents. You can find, say, that Jewish pamphlet on segregation that was printed by the Citizens Council. You can find that online. I believe that the Mississippi Department of Archives and History has a copy available online. Yeah. There are probably other places where you can find that. Those are all places. The list goes on and on, but oral histories, memoirs, sermons, letters.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I feel like we, as like a Jewish community and also sort of ISJL staff members, have been talking a lot over the past several months, especially sort of after the murder of George Floyd, the ensuing Black Lives Matter protests, about how Jews can stand in solidarity with Black people in the United States. And I know that you and I have talked about this a lot. And I'm curious about, sort of coming from this context of the presentation you just gave, what are sort of some lessons from this history that you take about sort of how we stand in solidarity?
For me, it's, let's see, give me a second. For me, it's that solidarity is really precarious and is not a given. That the narratives of, again, sort of a natural or innate, like commonality or empathy, can actually don't always work for us. And there's good work being done on this. There's a recent essay called Against Analogy. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the author right now. But essentially that histories of Jewish marginalization, of Jewish suffering, aren't necessarily going to actually don't necessarily lead white Jews in the United States to do the necessary work. And also just to state that, and I believe this comes straight from the article, I'm might be directly quoting, I might be paraphrasing, but essentially that, centuries of Black experiences of marginalization and of oppression are best understood on their own terms. We don't, the singer Anthony Russell, who we're both huge fans of, has a great tweet about this, right? That it shouldn't take a radical act of historical imagination to realize that racism is bad. Like, we shouldn't have to equate it to Jewish suffering to recognize it as bad on its own terms. That doesn't completely foreclose the idea that that understanding one might help illuminate the other in some way, but that maybe it's not necessary.
That's a great answer. I will add that the article is by Ben Ratzkoff. It's in Jewish Currents. I just linked it in the Facebook comments for those who are interested in reading. I'm just checking to see where we are with any questions from folks. Awesome. I'm trying to think of, I'm curious sort of for you as a historian, doing this research, what do you think is sort of a, oh, sorry, seeing another question here. Awesome. Much of the civil rights era history you discussed focused on the Deep South states. Did Jewish communities in other Southern states, Virginia, Texas, Kentucky, et cetera, have a different experience, response, or perspective on civil rights?
That's a great question. Let's see. So partly you can look to what, Krauss's sort of formulation of the land of the almost possible and the land of the almost impossible. Subregions in the South matter, right? The Deep South is different than Virginia. Another factor is sort of the community size. In a lot of cases, actually, it's in many cases, actually, I think that the presence of military bases or other sort of large sort of federal institutions really changed really affected how civil rights stuff happened. If you had, essentially, if the federal government could threaten to withhold resources, it was actually a big incentive for places to sort of quietly desegregate. I know that was the case in parts of I want to say in Fort Walton Beach in North Florida. I heard a story like that where essentially it was, there were some, I believe it was a Jewish judge there, and this is stuff was right at the edge of my memory. At any rate, some local Jewish leadership there were involved in some of the desegregation efforts in parts of North Florida. And I know that there, it was possible to do so in part because the federal government, because of all the Army bases, actually sort of held the purse strings of the local school district, which was paid for the attendance of kids of military personnel. Anyway, so you see different examples. Yeah, Nashville is a different situation than Jackson, Mississippi. Atlanta is a different situation, right? This at least thinks of itself at the time as the city too busy to hate, where Jews, including rabbis, had probably more latitude to speak out, right? Texas, I'm trying to think of good Texas examples. I know actually Josh Furman is going to be doing some speaking about Texas. I don't know if that's already happened or not, but Josh Furman at Rice University, I know can actually speak directly on the situation of Texas. And in Texas, you're going to see a huge difference, right, between small towns and big cities. Dallas, I would say, would have been a somewhat hard place to be an activist. There was a pretty strong tradition of white supremacist as well as anti-labor activism or anti-labor violence there. I know during sort of the like say the 1930s, 1940s. Yeah. So, and Virginia, I can't think of it. I need to probably go do some reading on Virginia civil rights Jewish history, because there I don't have good examples to sort of for comparison.
Thank you, that's helpful. I am going to again remind viewers that if you have questions, you can please feel free to put them in the comments on this video, and we'll get to them. I'm curious to sort of go off something that you sort of briefly mentioned in that last answer, and I know that we in our first virtual vacation session, you were talking about your research with the Arbiter Ring, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how sort of Jewish attitudes towards civil rights sort of intersect with Jewish like labor organizing.
Yeah, so it's interesting because there are, I mentioned the Workmen's Circle as well as the IWO. There are sort of labor-oriented Jewish organizations in the South. They're not primarily made up of union workers, right? So like, this is true in the North to some extent too, but like even in a Workmen's Circle in the 30s and 40s, it's a bunch of shopkeepers. There are a handful of folks who maybe work in the garment industry or in another unionized or potentially unionized field. But for the most part, these are sort of small business owners. But they still sort of identified with the cause. And in some cases were involved in some sort of cross-racial labor work. So Mitchell Merlin in Atlanta was sort of Mr. Arbiter Ring in the city for decades. And I know that in the post-war era, he was involved in sort of center-left coalition that was trying to do labor education and sort of promote organized labor on a biracial basis in Atlanta, say in the 1940s. So this, getting into sort of long civil rights history, which is very much tied up in labor organizing in the South. You have those folks who went with the IWO, who were communist or sort of communist leaning. They had sort of top-down instructions to organize a little more biracially, right? That was the Communist Party sort of viewed that as a winning tactic in the South. This is, again, we're talking about a small sliver of Southern Jews, but a very interesting one. So Borenstein, who I showed the picture of, if someone was trying to organize on a biracial basis in Chattanooga, Borenstein's grocery store was the place to do that. He had sort of a secret back room there, and it was in sort of a mixed neighborhood where it wouldn't attract too much attention, that folks would be walking into the storefront, both white and black. In Atlanta, if you look at the memoirs of some radical Black organizers who were active in, say, Alabama and Atlanta, some of them talk about at least having some contact with these Atlanta Jewish radicals who would, throw them some free groceries or try to provide them some money to continue their activities, say in the 1930s and 1940s. So there is some intersection with sort of the labor movement, right? And a lot of where we see this, there's some continuity between labor organizing in the South in the 1930s and even in the 1940s, and then what emerges as the civil rights movement during what we think of as the classical era.
Awesome, thank you. I'm curious about if you feel like there's a certain avenue or sort of an aspect of this story that you want to explore further, or that you wish that you or others like knew more about as we try to sort of put together this picture.
Yeah, I'm interested in, I mean, if at some point in the future, I'm kind of interested in really trying to tackle sort of some of these Jewish segregationists, folks who, for one reason or another, were really opposed to desegregation during the 1950s and 1960s. There's a fascinating example of a rabbi in Clarksdale, Mississippi, for part of this period, was Rabbi Benjamin Schultz, who was infamous for being sort of a McCarthyite. He had railed in the press in the late 40s and early 50s. He had sort of railed in the press against mainstream Jewish leaders who he had sort of accused of being dupes of a communist plot to sort of destabilize the United States, and was really, and then for a while, sort of he ran this like Jewish anti-communist organization and was really like persona non grata in like a lot of rabbinical circles. Well, he ends up sort of going back into, goes back to get a pulpit, and Clarksdale is a place that'll hire him because they know that unlike some of the new folks coming out of Cincinnati, coming out of Hebrew Union College there, he's not going to promote segregation or desegregation, right? That he sort of views it as a communist plot. And so by virtue of his anti-communism, it seems that basically his anti-communism leads him to be pro-segregation, and he stirs up some controversy here in Mississippi. And that, I mean, there's work on him that's been done, but looking into him and some other figures seems like an interesting sort of direction to go, to really think about how it is that the Jews get wrapped up in this stuff in those really explicit ways, as well as in sort of all the implicit ways that white Jews are wrapped up in racism in the South and nationally.
Amazing. We have another question from one of our viewers. Hello, Lou. So glad that you're joining us. Was there any relationship between the anti-desegregation, so I guess the segregationist rabbis, and the anti-Zionist rabbis?
That's a good question. I'm thinking that those actually don't necessarily track. Let me think. No, my guess, and you'd have to, someone else might have the answer to this, or maybe you just have to compare side by side. My guess is that the anti-Zionist rabbis were not necessarily the ones who leaned more towards segregation, because there is this classical reform tradition of social justice that's happening in the progressive era, so happening in the early 20th century certainly. And so you would have rabbis who are very classical reform, and for that reason really want Jews to first and foremost be loyal to the United States, who also are somewhat racially progressive. I'm trying to think, like Ira Sanders in Little Rock was pretty racially progressive in the 20s and 30s, and continued to be so throughout his tenure there in Little Rock. And I want to say that he started out, I think, as anti-Zionist or non-Zionist. I think that changed over the course of his career, but I don't think you'd see a correlation there. But that's, I wouldn't, don't cite me in a text on that answer.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh. I want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. I want to give you a little bit of an update about what's happening with the virtual vacation. upcoming. It has been just personally just so much fun to work on this program and put this together and to have such a great response. I'm glad that we're sort of continuing to have that. The ISJL Virtual Vacation is taking a 2-week hiatus in observance of high holidays because the ISJL has a lot of really cool high holidays programming upcoming. Our next session, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen once more. Our next session is going to be a virtual visit to Selma, Alabama on Tuesday, October 6th. I am so excited about this one. Taking tour groups through Selma is one of the highlights of my job. It's an honor to visit this incredible place with people from across the country. And Selma is the site of the historic Selma to Montgomery March in 1965, which played a key role in the passage of the Voting Rights Act and was really a watershed moment in the civil rights movement. So you can visit the ISJL Virtual Vacation website to watch all of our past programs, read all of our weekly emails, which are super rich and have lots of really cool resources and activities in them, and to also receive updates about our upcoming programs. The people who receive our emails hear about them first, and I would love to count you among them. I'm really proud of these first 4 sessions. There's so much more to come. Before we see each other next, we are going to celebrate the new year. I hope that you'll take advantage of the ISJL's high holiday resources, including streaming services for Rosh Hashanah this Friday evening and Saturday morning. And you can learn more about all of that on our website and social media. So thank you again so much. And we will see you in Selma on Tuesday, October 6th.